Thank you so much for being with us, Sarah. I'm so excited for this.
So good to connect, always, really.
So I just devoured your book. I devoured your book. Just like, it was like, it's like so packed. How long did it take you to write it?
Well, I had a lot of help, just folks who had experience with just looking at my other work I'd written. And so it took about 3 years really of, actually at one point, because I didn't know how books worked, it was double the size that you were supposed to deliver it to the publisher. And I didn't realize, I was like, oh, isn't that abundant and good? And they're like, no.
It's going to be like this thick.
Oh my Lord. So half the book we had to kind of gut in a way. And yet that, I understand that that's sort of the point, is like succinctness, not infinite data, it's so it did get distilled down. So about 3 years of working on it to get it out there. Yeah.
I had this flash as I was reading, like, wow, this is so exciting. Like, I haven't been this excited about a book since I read, I love the book by Stephen Buhner. I don't know if you've read it, called The Lost Language of Plants.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah. I mean, what an honor to even be associated vaguely or loosely with that book. Yes.
It's just like, it's like a similar style of writing. You have, but like, you're such an elegant speaker and writer.
Well, it must be because I've been taking your flower remedies for the past 3 years.
Oh, that's it.
I mean, I've got mine right now, and it's just been here the whole time that I set the studio up. I love them.
Thank you.
It's a product placement, but it's just like totally genuine. Like, I need you to know that's been super helpful.
Yeah, I saw little like, there were like little sparks in your book where I was like, oh, I can't wait to get into that. Like, because I mean, oh my God, there is so much stuff. Okay, can I just say, everyone has to get this book. And I'm not just saying that, like, you just have to get this book. It's called Regenerate. And it's just packed with so much information that every single person needs to have. Right?
Well, thank you. I mean, I hope that it really helps people. And I did really try to put in the things that got me excited about life even, and yet it's difficult at points because the science, you get down to molecular biology and then even quantum biology, and who really knows what's going on? And it's presumptuous for me to write about it. I understand. And yet I think the implications are so fascinating, exciting. That's why I felt like, you know what, let me put a little unicorn dust here, and so so.
Maybe I'll just like breeze through really quick, like the notes that I pulled out, so any of the listeners can get like a sense of the breadth and depth of this incredible book. I mean, because Sayre's like a genius. He went from microbiome, talking about the things that affect our microbiome and how it's so powerful for our health. He talked about the beauty of plants. I loved that, where you talked about, what plants are capable of despite being immobile. The importance of sunlight, melanin, grounding, earthing, all kinds of information on inflammation research, energy, quantum physics. You had such a great quote in there. I pulled out so many quotes, and I want to talk about so many of the things in there. There's enough energy in the space of a teacup to convert all the world's oceans to steam. That's so poetic.
That was Richard Feynman too, right? It's just this physicist that they have to speak in poetry to try to articulate the truth. I mean, that's true. Yes. That's how much energy is available at any point in space and time, apparently.
You talk about chemo, radiation, war on cancer, fear, all the different types of conventional cancer approaches to the more human approaches, emotions, how they affect our health. You have this huge section on brain health, heart health, anti-aging, and then, like, as if that weren't enough, because you pack it with like so many good tips. At the end, you have this whole like regeneration plan, which I am eating an apple.
You're eating an apple. That's so
just coincidentally.
Wow, you really read this book. That's amazing. Thank you. I feel so honored that you would take the time
Oh my God, it's so beautiful.
Wow.
So can I pick out the parts I'm like the most stoked about and just tackle them, and then we can, I mean, there's so much in here that people need to know, but I got really excited when you talked about light powered water.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Structured water.
Totally. I'm so excited about it too, Katie. So Gerald Pollack out in Washington University, I went to his laboratory, and he's got this whole understanding of water, which is based on how it actually appears, not just our sort of like assumptions about it and projections. And it's fascinating, but it's structured in a very specific way in biological systems. And one of the ways that it operates is it works like, it's almost like a molecular battery, and it's able to harvest the sunlight energy in a way that basically helps to power all living things. I mean, to the point where it explains why, for example, like the heart has like 7-8 seconds of ATP, which is supposedly going to explain to us the mystery of the body. And yet we have 100,000 miles of tubing that the blood has to be pumped through. That's like an infinite amount of energy is required. And it's explained by how water creates, it's called an exclusion zone off of water-loving surfaces, which the blood vessels are water-loving. And that is what's actually powering, that's what's driving the pump, if you will. And I saw in his laboratory, they took a piece of Naflon, which is synthetic tubing, and it's water-loving, just like the blood vessels. And it's a closed system. It's just water and tubing, and it's just a perpetual flow system. It's like infinitely powered forever by the just ambient energy in the environment from the sun. So anyway, and then he had a LED that was coming off of just water cells, showing like literally it's turned right into actual light again from the water, and there's nothing else powering it. It's just the ambient infrared in the environment.
And these are things happening in our body, right?
Exactly. Every single moment is happening in trillions of our cells, and it's part of the miracle of life. And it's so decenters the sort of glucose-centric view that we're just sort of like these furnaces burning things, like into smoke.
Put something in your mouth and burn it up.
Yeah, it's like, 60s, 70s industrial revolution set of myths that have predominated now for hundreds of years. And now the new biology, which is the actual biology that we are, is saying, hello, actually, no, I'm actually a miracle. And yes, there's some new ways of understanding it through science, but that science is more in congruence with, let's say, quantum mechanics versus, classical Newtonian laws.
And we're more like plants than we would think. I mean, like the whole thing about how modern culture today is just like slapping on the sunscreen, which has been shown to increase rates of skin cancer, versus just like allowing ourselves to go out. You know how good you feel when you're like lying on the beach and the sun bakes into you, right? It's kind of like common sense, but like you lay it out so beautifully why it's so important.
Thank you. Yeah, like even myself, I've always been someone who wants to know how things work before I allow myself to feel them, which is kind of twisted. It's sort of like, that's not how you're supposed to experience them, and then that's how it works. But so when I start to understand this, it would be like I'm in Miami and I'm out, running a lot in the sun, and I'll go out of my way and I'll eat something rich in chlorophyll, because part of the discovery is that we are actually plant-like. And it makes us even more like flowers, and even more dependent on them in ways. And so the chlorophyll goes into the mitochondria as a metabolite called PBE, and it enables us to harvest the sunlight and turn it into more efficient ATP production. So we're actually in the middle between autotrophs and heterotrophs, right? Like plants and animals, we're called photoheterotrophic, because we actually can take energy from the sun and turn it into metabolic energy.
So essentially, we're not just getting our energy from food. We are getting a ton of energy from the sun, right?
Absolutely.
I love that.
Just like plants.
And then there was this part in the book where it reminded me so much of my flower essence teacher, because you quoted something out of the Journal of Inflammation Research.
Huh.
The human body is equipped with a system-wide collagenous liquid crystalline semiconductor network known as the living matrix. And I remember studying, when I was first studying flower essences with my teacher from Spain, he used to talk about how we have this crystalline structure in our blood and in the fluids of the body, and how flower essences were essentially operating on that crystalline structure.
Oh, yeah.
And so I wondered if you wanted to just like talk a little bit about what does that mean, that we're a living matrix of liquid crystalline semiconductors?
Oh, wow. It's such a great question, because I didn't fully answer the first one, which is directly the answer to this one, which is that Gerald Pollack's work on the fourth phase of water shows that there is a fourth phase, right, that is like a crystal. And it's fact, it built itself in hexagonal sheets in what's called the exclusion zone. So, you know, all physical things, biomolecules, if you will, have a hydration shell. And so most of biology has basically been based on an abstract concept, it's dehydrated science, like water's not relevant. And what's happening is now
we're just like, would like walk in pieces of flesh.
Exactly.
Like meat bags walking around.
Desiccated pieces of jerky, basically. And even jerky has mostly water. But that's what Jerry's helped us understand, is 99% of the molecules in the human body are actually water by number. And they form as crystals, actually in the form of H3O2. So it's not H2O, it's actually a completely different configuration. They're hexagonal sheets. And the way that the water microclusters is itself an energy state and an information state.
Oh, I love it.
Oh, I love it too. And when you think about homeopathy, the memory in the water concept, which has been validated now through so many different ways, you know, it's as if the people that claim that it's woo or whatever that means, I mean, woo, it's like, are they actually aware of scientific principles anymore? Like, aren't they saying they're scientific and, you know, sort of homeopathic medicine and science isn't? Well, that's not true. In fact, I think we know now that we're crystals, basically. We're living crystals. And like crystals, I have my Lemurian right here. I love these things. I mean, they hold a lot of information and energy. So anyway, so to your point, these remedies are interacting with that layer, that part of the phenomenological layer of things that, of course, conventional water science has overlooked, and helps to explain how, there's so many ways we can go into this, because my own father has been diving deep into this question about, you know, like protein folding and enzyme catalysis is all really based on water changing before the protein. It's called the Frank codon principle, and before you see a protein folding change, the water shifts. And so that means that if we can affect water with something like acoustics or a flower essence subtly, it can have a huge magnifying effect. And then it's sort of like top down, like consciousness down to the physical layer. So, you know, and that would explain why, Katie, like sometimes I'm taking your remedies and it's like a nebulous thing that's so subtle, but nebulous in the sense that's changed my entire experience. And how is that possible? I feel even energetically like, wait, I went from feeling heavy and inflamed and like a physical object to, wow, I'm like a light being, like one of Katie's light being friends now, you know? So the science will end up continually validating the type of modality that you have dedicated your life to spreading around like a pollinator.
Thank goodness. I mean, if you look at like one of my favorite studies that I always go back to is like this 10-year longitudinal study in France where they literally figured out that individual happiness instantaneously affects collective happiness of people you don't even know. So like in this very moment, you and I here are sitting, right, chatting, your state of mind, my state of mind are instantaneously affecting other human beings that we don't even know, that are strangers to us.
Wow.
So if when you're looking at the science of like our human bodies, our crystals, we're essentially transmitting energy. We're transmitters of energy constantly, right?
Yes. I love it. Yeah.
And I love what you said. I mean, I think you got this work from, was a Latino fellow, but you talked about, you know what, I'm going to read this quote. It's just so good. Mario Martinez on biocognition. Can I read this?
Please, yeah.
You talked about how he described 3 archetypal human wounds: shame, abandonment, and fear. Ooh, favorites.
I got plenty of those.
How they're stitched into different illness challenges, producing corresponding bodily patterns and energetic fields. It's freaking fascinating. So each of these wounds is inflicted and co-created by different cultural settings. For example, shame can be the product of teasing, bullying, judgment, criticism, ridicule, or guilt trips. And it manifests as a hot, humiliated, pro-inflammatory phenotype that is characteristic of autoimmune disease. Oh my God, fascinating. Okay, so essentially you're saying states of shame can lead to autoimmune disease or conditions, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And then you say betrayal is associated with broken promises, infidelity, abuse, or lack of integrity, and causes an angry fight or flight reaction involving adrenaline and cortisol, leading to the phenotype of heart disease. And finally, last but not least, abandonment can result from neglect, lack of support, and invisibility, represented by a cold and fearful adrenaline-based fight or flight reaction, oftentimes associated with cancer. Fascinating.
I know. I'm still trying to figure out what it all means myself. I think we're in an era now called Aquarian medicine where we're starting to see narrative medicine is one legitimate discipline now that's emerging, which sort of blends together humanistic psychology and spirituality with biomedicine. And, these innovators are helping us to sort of stitch together that interstitial space, which is where we live. Because I could have osteoarthritis, and maybe I experienced when I was a child cowering, and it could have even been symbolic because my father was this towering intellectual. And yes, over time, the immobility leads to some calcification, and there's, diagnostically interleukin, whatever, upregulation. And so, but then the other deeper layer is, why did I end up with the immobility? And, it could be that both are true, and there's many layers. But it's just fascinating. Humans are so multidimensional that there's so many causes. I've given up trying to find the one cause on pretty much anything anymore.
Oh my God. Yeah. So that in terms of when you talk about cancer. So I used to have a teacher by the name of Dr. Marvin. He was a PhD, but it was a PhD in like gems and a gemology. He's no longer in the country, I think, because he was curing people a bit too much, so he had to leave.
Okay.
But he used to tell me, which reminds me of your work on cancer in the book. He used to say, this whole thing about cancer is such a sham. He would say, because we name cancer by the parts of the body, right? So carcinoma just literally means like dead or damaged cells in the heart. Melanoma means dead or damaged cells in the skin. But the idea that there is this one singular cure for cancer is such a joke, because there are millions of causes for cancer and millions of cures.
Yes, that's so good. Wow.
And I love how you say in the book, we can't talk about cancer without talking about fear.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about this idea of, aggressive, the body is going against us, as well as like overdiagnosis and false alarm, and how some of the actual screening processes can cause cancer?
Absolutely. I think in my work over the past 10 years, what I stumbled upon was an awareness that a lot of what we describe as cancer, as if it's a fully figured out sort of juggernaut of lethality, is actually a tissue abnormality that would be completely harmless. And
Thank you.
like, so that's what overdiagnosis is premised upon. In the case of breast, quote, cancer, we have to put the quote on that. 1.3 million women were diagnosed with DCIS, or ductal carcinoma in situ, which literally means non-expanding, expanding, because cancer literally like a crab expands, and it's in situ means it stands still. And so they used to sometimes describe it as stage 0. But so needless to say, because of the almost Bush era preemptive war doctrine in medicine, they assumed, oh, there's something suspicious. Guess what? You're going to die unless we cut out the organ entirely and then blast you with radiation and chemo. And so we had 1.3 million women who went through this process. And then in 2013, the National Cancer Institute commissioned an expert panel that finally affirmed something that I and a few other people had been talking about for almost a decade, which is that DCIS is not cancer at all. It shouldn't be called cancer. If anything, call it a benign or indolent lesion of epithelial origin. And now they're finding the same may, and I will say is true for most of the prostate cancers that were diagnosed through PSA tests. And then you can add in thyroid and lung cancer, a lot of incidentalomas they're called. You go in for a routine screening, you're asymptomatic, you have no symptoms, and they're like, well, we see something suspect. Oh, it's cancer, and then they treat you as if it's life-threatening. Now, what happens, this is a separate layer. There was this powerful Swedish study, 500,000 Swedes. They looked at the registries and found that when someone was told whether they had cancer or not after a test, if it was a positive diagnosis, then the chance of dying from a heart-related death within 1 week was up to 26.9-fold higher than those who received a negative finding. It was heart-related, and suicide also scaled, because they were grief-stricken. They were heartbroken because the big C word had been used. Now remember, this is irregardless of whether there was actually anything of concern. So the power of,
oh my God.
Right, the power we outsource to others, and like it could be the guy in the white coat robe, or it could be shaman. We've been doing this since the beginning of time. When we don't have direct, intimate experience and sort of ownership of our own bodies, then we end up falling prey to what, unfortunately, in this case, is about $1 trillion medical industry that is no longer really regulated because, the FDA is captured, et cetera.
And that $1 trillion industry, I don't know if you have stats on this, but my question would be, how many die of the treatment that costs so much versus that would have kept going had they just left well enough alone? I mean, it's like when anybody who's had a dog, right? Yeah. And this is just common sense. Anyone who's had a dog that ages, they get these funny little things hanging off and little tumors and, or like, let's say we all might have like a closet or a junk drawer. It doesn't mean we have to like gut the whole kitchen because we have a junk drawer.
Take a flamethrower to it. Yeah.
So how many people do you think are dying from the treatment and not the actual weird cells?
I love that you asked that question. It's a courageous one. And it's one that, I've had to ask over the course of the past decade. And my answer is that I think the vast majority are being harmed more by the treatment than the actual, quote, condition. And I think that's affirmed by one of the greatest discoveries of our time in cancer biology is that there are these cancer stem cells that are about 1 in 10,000 cells in an entire tumor. So you'd think that, wow, that's not a lot of cells. What's the big deal? Well, those are the only cells that are able to replicate an entire tumor. They're almost like a zygote in embryogenesis. In fact, that's what Nicholas Gonzalez believed in his trophoblast theory of the origin of cancer, is that they're literally like little embryonic cells that can produce an entirely new organ or organism. And so cancer, in light of that, when they use conventional treatments like radiation or chemo, they're debulking. It's called debulking. They're trying to shrink the size of the tumor. And guess what? It's successful. You can cut it out, burn it out, you can poison it out. But what happens is the cancer stem cells actually are extremely resistant to those treatments, and their populations increase the very moment that the tumor size decreases. So it's called stem cell enrichment. So it's like an antibiotic resistant infection. Basically at first you give the antibiotic, the bacteria collapses in. There's a few that are resistant and they go dormant, and then when the conditions are right, they pop back even worse. And then you give the antibiotic and they're just laughing at you. In fact, your immune system fails further and they take over. And then you blame the infection when in fact it was the treatment, because it caused a sort of escape mutant, if you will, to occur. So the same happens with cancers. That's why there's such high levels of recurrence following conventional treatments. In fact, chemotherapy and radiation have both been shown to drive further resistance and in some cases revert non-cancer stem cells into cancer stem cells. That's one of the more ironic and honestly tragic aspects of conventional treatment.
Why are we fighting Mother Nature? That's my question. If in all of the research you're doing, which is valid scientific research,
yes,
shows that we stick around longer if we just follow Mother Nature.
Yes, that's it. And here's the beautiful spiritual question you asked is how can we know? Because the moment you go ahead and do conventional treatment or even natural, you really can't go back in time and know what would have happened if you did the other. So my ultimate advocacy is certainly just informed consent. I just want people to know they have a choice, and that even knowing that they can't actually know what would have happened had they not taken their route. So once you make that commitment, go with it, get the best out of it. But keep in mind, there are other choices. And if the medical establishment is not providing you full access to that information, it violates the medical ethical principle of informed consent. That was laid down after the Nuremberg trials. So we don't want to experiment on people. And you're really experimenting on them if you say, oh, there's only one treatment, it happens to be deadly, called chemotherapy and radiation, and forget about all the other stuff here that actually has been used since time immemorial and that may be far better for you. We just want to affirm people's choice, that's all.
And typically chemo and radiation would kill additional cells in the body, right? So if we think of cancer as a condition of damaged or dead cells simply, rather than an aggressor, and then we add those treatments into the mix, we're killing and damaging more cells. And according to the theory you were giving earlier about the cancer stem cells spreading, wouldn't it then make sense that those would be introduced into the overabundance of more damaged and dead cells, which could possibly, you might be able to just commonsensically, in a real down-to-earth way, say that you just exacerbated the problem by creating more of it?
Absolutely. In fact, the mechanism by which conventional treatments work, so conventional chemotherapy was thought first originated out of the chemical weapons use in war. It's because they're highly genotoxic to fastly replicating cells. Unfortunately, immune cells are fastly replicating. That's how they work. That's how they respond. And so,
wait, let me interrupt you just to make sure I understood you correctly. Are you saying that chemo came from chemical weapons?
Yeah, exactly. Like you've heard of mustard gas, for example. That was one of the inspirations behind modern chemotherapy. And the reason why it works is because when a cell's replicating, it's in mitosis and exposes its chromosomes to damage. And so the faster the cell replicates, and that's why pediatric cancers are the most abundant today, because their cells are replicating so quickly. They're so susceptible to these genotoxic agents. But the idea is that chemo and radiation work by being carcinogenic. They literally damage DNA as their mechanism of therapeutic action. And so what happens is cancer stem cells actually are relatively quiescent. That is why they're stem cells, because they're supposed to be protected from excessive division so they don't lose their genetic purity. And so they're quiescent, they divide and are able to create the other cells that differentiate into daughter tumor cells. So the theory then, or the explanation, is that when we use chemo and radiation, they not only damage these fast replicating cells, but also the immune system. That's That's unfortunately, and so that's the part of modern conventional cancer treatment that is unfortunately absurdly overlooked, is that it's immunotoxic. That's the mechanism of action. And what we want to do is support immunity. That's why Gerson therapy and natural therapy and so many other ways of approaching cancer exist, but they're certainly never offered as the standard of care.
And you have a whole section in your book about the more human approach to cancer treatment.
Yes, yes. And really it's about understanding it. So in other words, when you understand the body is responding in a way to try to heal, then we start to understand it through a more compassionate lens. It's not something that's happening inside our body and there's a terrorist spreading. That's how people think of it. But it's the body, right? It's the body responding to what are essentially unnatural environmental challenges and doing a pretty good job, because the stem cells are there to replenish and replace damaged tissue. So after a while, when the conditions fall apart and certain foods, for example, full of good information aren't in the diet, the genetic integrity fails and you end up with this adaptive response, which unfortunately in some cases starts to take over the host and kill it. But it's not a rational process fundamentally.
Well, and it's also not a dead end, right? It's something that, which is like the basis of your entire book, that it's reversible.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's not a death sentence.
No, it's not. In fact, the thought that it's a death sentence is why it's so deadly. You know, the prognosis is the same thing. It means to know the future of going to a crystal ball reader, which actually they're kind of accurate, and then at times, and then a tea leaf reader. I mean, there's no difference between a oncologist coming in saying, we did your test and here's your 6 months to live because we failed for the past 100 years and this is what we predict we're going to fail for you on. Yeah. The idea, right, is like they're pointing a bone at you. They're saying you're going to die. And because you believe them, of course, they're the authority, right? And you die. But the reality is that when we take back control and responsibility for our health, we're no longer susceptible to that type of sorcery. I'm not saying it's intentional, but it is the same thing as being like in a Harry Potter novel, interacting with conventional medical folks on this topic. You have to be really careful that they were themselves, interestingly, trained by pharmaceutical companies and their thinking, and pharmacosin. Pharmacia literally means sorcery. That's a Greek word for sorcery. So it's so interesting to me that the etymologies speak to the truth of what's actually happening. Because if you think about this, this is $1 trillion industry and there are millions of people dying, and they're still claiming the best we can do is raise more funds for a cause that is, unknown and a cure that doesn't exist. And that's absolutely absurd. We do know the causes, and we do, as you said, there's 1 million cures for 1 million different people. Everyone's going to have their own path to it. But my hope is that people at least know that it exists for them, that they can heal radically from all the most feared diseases of our time. And that's a birthright. It's not because I said it. I don't need studies to prove it. It's just that's, it's like the flowers, they will guide us. I do know that that's true.
Yes. It's like a flag, just a red flag that something needs to change.
Yes.
Okay, shifting gears a little. Can we shift?
Sorry, it's an intense topic, I know.
No, I love it. I absolutely love it, because it's like, the things that have been told to us are not actually true, and we can trust in our own body's innate wisdom. It's doing exactly what it needs to do. Of course, you're going to put all your crap in a junk drawer. You're not going to spread it across your kitchen counter. You shove it in the junk drawer. Yeah. That's what the body does. That's smart. Exactly. Yeah. And then, okay, so I know I'm all over the place, but
it's my favorite things to be everywhere.
In terms of radiation, I got psyched because I was reading your portion of the book about melanin, and you call them jelly ear mushrooms. I also know them as wood ear fungus. This is something that Taylor, who works with me, it was her favorite food in Taiwan. Just funky little fungus things, right? And we eat them in almost every meal. And then, of course, we hear a lot about chaga these days. Yeah. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about either substances that have melanin, or grounding or earthing, or some of the other practices that can reduce harmful effects of this type of like electrical currents that aren't natural in our body, and how we can juice up or amplify the natural currents.
Totally. So with melanin, what's fascinating is post-Chernobyl, you know, the inside of the still steaming reactor remains had this really dark fungal growth, and they were able to discover that it was thriving off of radiation that was clearly one of the most deadly of all things on the planet to be exposed to if you're living. And, you know, they've now discovered even certain bacteria, some of which probably exist in our gut, are able to ingest the, you know, energy that comes directly from uranium and other elements.
Isn't that wonderful? Like, doesn't that make you so happy knowing there's an organism out there that just thrives on radiation?
Oh my God, so much so. Because see, I spent so much time, Katie, down the rabbit hole post-Fukushima, trying to understand what are the real risks of low-dose radioisotope exposure. We're talking about research that is so terrifying, which is that actually there's orders of magnitude greater harms than present radiological risk assessments and regulations allow. But then I started to go deeper and found there was this incredible research showing that melanin, which is an incredible biomolecule, in fact, some believe it may be the first molecule necessary for life itself, even before self-replicating molecules, because here's one of its amazing properties is it's able to basically take in the radiation within the entire electromagnetic spectrum, which is from like radio waves to gamma rays, really huge wavelengths to really small, theoretically deadly. And that's why it's so dark, right? It's like a black hole. And we have it throughout all our tissues, in especially important areas, like the substantia nigra, right, in the brain that they believe in Parkinson's, for example, degrades and can't produce enough dopamine. Well, why is it there deep in the brain? And what is it doing? Well, part of it is it's able to disassociate the water molecule, not unlike photolysis and photosynthesis, which causes an effect that releases a lot of energy. It's similar to the fourth phase of water. It's a form of creating a molecular battery, and as well as a proton gradient, which is essential for, you know, ATP production. And then it produces molecular oxygen and hydrogen. So it's basically getting oxygen deep within the tissues of our brain and producing profound energy. Now, this is happening throughout our bodies naturally. But when you consume like a mushroom that's melanized, you're getting additional benefit because it may, at least in the animal studies, it's very compelling, cause animals to take what are essentially highly toxic wavelengths of radiation and convert it into what may be actually beneficial metabolic energy. And so, you know, why would that be the case? Well, because, you know, these radioisotopes, including plutonium, which I used to think was just man-made until Kelly showed me, you know, Kelly Brogan, of course, showed me a assay of Himalayan sea salt that showed it has naturally occurring plutonium. So I looked deeper into it, and yes, it does exist in the universe. So life evolved, you know, with this as a source of energy. So of course, why wouldn't it take advantage of it? So it's given me a better sense of our radical resilience. And, you know, hopefully that gives a little bit of an explanation for it.
Radical resilience. I love that. I mean, think it's kind of mind-boggling to think that there are all these things coming out, like, you know, now we're working with cell phones and computers at a rate that's, you know, we weren't doing in the 70s or 80s. And then there's this whole topic of 5G and how that's going to affect us as well. But the fact that there are substances in nature like mushrooms that help us process radiation, and I'm thinking of a flower essence called yarrow that helps the body revitalize its natural energies after being exposed to EMFs.
Oh, wow.
Like, how phenomenal is that these things exist in Mother Nature and they existed before? Well, you're saying, like, you know, there's this stuff on the Himalayan pink salt.
But not like you're saying now, it's like everywhere. So you're right. Like, it's already there. To almost predicted the advent of this really crazy, it's the Anthropocene, they call it, this epoch ruled by human invention and toxicity, if you will. I agree. That's fascinating. It's like the cytochrome P450 oxidases in the liver that are, sort of already sitting there waiting for us to create this chemical nightmare and somehow helping us to navigate through it. But I didn't know that about yarrow. That's really good to know, because this is a really big and important topic, and I was not aware of that.
Yeah, it's funny because when the very first flower essence collection trip I went on, I made a flower essence of that flower. It was like shown to me by a snake, which sounds really weird, but this was like that trip where the animals showed me where to go, and the snake went off into this patch of white flowers.
Huh.
And we put that in one of our formulas, like our first top 6 blend formulas. And I remember Lisa, who runs The Way of Chocolate, I remember her just saying, like, why do you even use that flower? Like, nobody's drawn to it. Nobody is attracted to it. Nobody likes it. Like why is that even in your formula? It was so funny. And I just kind of like, waited and waited and waited. And then when we went to Japan, this was post Fukushima.
Yes.
Every person that we asked in Tokyo, with showing them photos of flowers, which one are you most attracted to? Every single person picked yarrow.
Stop. That's so cool.
And so then it was like, oh, finally, here we have an object, a person who, because we know that 99% of the time we're visually attracted to what is going to heal us. And
I didn't know that.
And then it was about, I would say 2 or 3 years ago, that I started then seeing Americans being drawn to that flower, which told me that because we're now more commonly drawn to it, the effects of widespread cell phone, smartphone, laptop, yada, 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 airplane use are now finally taking their toll on our bodies, which probably we could say is one of the reasons why magically mushrooms have made such a huge bang lately, right?
Oh my Lord, that's fascinating.
Like even just eating mushrooms, like I'm drawn to eating more shiitakes and stuff.
Yes, it is in the zeitgeist. I mean, I'm so amazed by, the work of Paul Stamets, of course, but even the resurgence of, what might be defined as psychedelic or entheogen fungi, because, in the 60s, clearly that was part of the revolution, and then it got highly suppressed, and now you're seeing it come into legitimacy with, John Hopkins and other, places validating. But yeah, I see it as part of the formula for protecting ourselves and navigating this critical time. I mean, Katie, we're in such a profound transition where I feel like the biosphere, we know how it can regenerate. We need it to regenerate for our own health to regenerate. So clearly it's not like some separate issue. So I feel like, with flower remedies and flowers, okay, that's what I wanted to say. Yeah. My book, one of the basic premises of Regenerate is that the angiosperm plants, the flowering plants, which subtend the majority of the foods we have in our food chain, they need us in order. It's not even like it's a needy relationship. It's more like it's like,
this is a codependency thing here.
No, yeah, I know. Because I used to think that I'm like, okay, well, in the case of grains, let's just face it. Like, do we really need more like wheat or GMOs, soy, and corn on the planet? I mean, they're clearly harvesting us, and we're not, we think we're harvesting them. But when it comes to the angiosperms in humans, the premise of my entire understanding of even the Gaia hypothesis today is that the reason why let's look at foods like, walnuts. I mean, come on, you can't make that up. It's just literally a skull with like omega-3 fatty acid rich hemispheres with the convolutions and everything in the corpus callosum right there. How is that possible other than God and magic and poetry and nature? Well, the microRNAs that exist in nature, they enable a horizontal transfer of essential genetic information in real time. Because the old Mendelian view was it took millions of years to even just see a slight change in the code of a protein coding gene. Now we know in the matter of minutes, you could eat a certain food and it will completely alter the expression of your genome. And so that's what gives us a certain plasticity and flexibility and helps us to understand that fruit-bearing trees, for example, that apple that you're eating, is just singing in joy that you're eating it, because actually it's hoping that you'll continue to disperse its seeds, because it doesn't use wind like other plants. It uses humans, and it wants them to be healthy and their reproductive system to be fruitful, and that's the beauty of it. And vice versa, we take good care of apple trees because we like them. We like the taste of apples. It's just a loving, joyous, sensual relationship. And that's kind of cool. It's like a little love affair going on here versus the more mechanical view of things, like survival of the fittest and my genes just want to take over your genes. That's like not what's going on, people. There's only an element of that going on, but not with beautiful flowering plants and humans.
Yeah, I think about diversity of foods, and in your book you talk about wonderful things like turmeric and ginger and rosemary and coffee and lion's mane and ginkgo, and it's like as time goes on, in some cultures it's like woven into their food system, like for thousands of years, but we Westerners, we're coming along and we're like discovering more diverse things, right, to include in our diets.
Totally.
I get excited thinking about flower essences, because you think about the different types of veggies to eat. And when you eat what are those things called? Fiddlehead ferns.
I love those things.
Like, don't you get so happy eating those? Because you're just like, your body must just be like, yes, what is this, right?
Spiral thing in it and everything. Those don't even have a psychedelic compound if not prepared properly, I think. But.
So if like I'm thinking of lately in the last couple months, I don't know what's going on, but I am taking so many flower essences. I used to just take like one or two occasionally. And lately I've just got like walls of them set up and I'm taking so many of them.
Wow.
And I'm curious, I'm just curious about your opinion of, this is essentially like light powered energy water from different flowers or flowering species around the planet.
Yeah.
What do you think possibly could be the role of that type of energetic diversity into our systems, especially at a time when stuff like 5G is rolling out and...
Well, it's interesting. Like, I'm always trying to figure out how to prepare water for consumption. Like, like if you do spring water, that's great if you can find it without exposure to plastics and other contaminants. But if you're doing RO, you're producing like an isolate. It's still bulk water. It's not structured. You need to find a way to do that. So I always think a little pinch of sea salt, maybe a little squeeze of lemon. But when I think about it, I think the flower essences are an amazing way to add additional structure and energy and intelligence into the water. Yes, that's something that has come up because of the way that water operates and vibrates. There's something about when you add in a remedy that will potentially restructure it, in a therapeutic way. So
you think it's essentially that I hear what you're saying, and I almost don't even take flower essences in the mouth anymore. I'm putting them in my water, in my drinks, in my teas, and then hydrating that way lately. So is that then in a sense a way to restructure the water so it feels to our bodies as if it was actually coming out of the earth?
Yes. No, I think that's what I'm realizing. And also because of, oh my Lord, we used to have an apartment in New York City, and the 500 Wi-Fi networks that we were exposed to.
Oh my God.
Can you imagine the destructuring of our body and our energetic field? And that's one thing that you've helped to create is these energetic restructuring formulas. So I think that's part of it. We're constantly getting like zapped. And this is one way to maintain a connection, to nature. And so I think that's probably part of it.
And I know you introduced me to Josh, and I'm going to have him on the show as well, but is there anything you want to share, just like the quick bullets on what's going on with 5G right now, since you're so involved?
Wow.
Like, what should people be aware of or just be looking out for?
Wow. We can go down the rabbit hole with that one too, because part of it has to do with real-time surveillance technology, like face recognition. We saw that in, the Hong Kong protests, and there's even like fashion now where they're trying to create ways so these real-time facial recognition systems don't operate. So it has a lot to do with rendering a capacity into being, not streaming faster Netflix videos on your phone. And why would anyone want to do that anyway? Yeah. So, and the reality is the active denial systems that the Department of Defense invested upon for many years rely on the same wavelengths because they can literally burn the skin of crowds. So it's for crowd control. So once you have these military style installations, they really look entirely totalitarian, gross, militaristic. They can direct they can beam form, and they can direct it towards individuals in a way that makes for, yeah.
That is, yeah. That's something that the fella I mentioned before.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
That's what happened before he left the country. He was like, I'm getting targeted.
Well, I mean, we even know how supposedly that happened in the Cuban embassy, and that microwaves have been used, right, in order to affect neuropsychiatric processes, cardiovascular. So I don't tend to go to that side of the equation, but I think people need to understand that this millimeter wave technology is really disruptive to the point where now you have meteorologists and astronomers, their societies saying, enough with this stuff. You're putting up these like arrays covering the entire biosphere. Elon Musk got permission for over 20,000 of these satellites. They are literally microwaving the entire biosphere. They upset the water molecules to the point where you can't predict the water, and it alters the way you can see stars. I mean, do people really fully understand what's happening? Why would they put $1 billion into this infrastructure just so you could stream videos faster on your phone?
No, there's something else going on.
Clear. It's so clear. It's a form of totalitarian control, and people still have an opportunity. They can push back. I know Josh and I did the 5G summit to empower people to be able to contact their lawmakers, and I think there's a lot of people waking up, but I think we have to be aware that yes, we're facing some really challenging times here.
And so when 5G rolls out, is it that there are smaller units all over the place, or is it that our bodies essentially become transmitters?
Well, that's a really good question, because with nanoparticles, metals specifically, unfortunately,
that could be sprayed in the air.
Well, yeah, they're already in our food chain, and vaccines obviously use a lot of nanoparticles, and definitely in the air for geoengineering purposes, if you will. It makes it much easier to surveil an individual when they have metal throughout their body. The millimeter wave wavelengths that they're going to use for the 5G systems enable them to penetrate right through houses to surveil. And ultimately, the small cells they need to put up every few houses exist because, you know, the wavelengths are smaller, and it's actually harder to penetrate certain things, so they need higher power density. The whole scenario is really disturbing. They have to cut certain trees down. It's just not a good thing.
Okay, so before we get too far down that rabbit hole, people should go to which website to be able to download all the juicy info about 5G?
Yeah, we have it on a full, free service for the rest of, it's just up there for people to see the whole summit. It's 5Gsummit.com?
Okay, we'll post that on the blog.
Yeah, I think that's the one. And they can see all 40 plus talks there. And just, really, it'll open one's eyes. And it has a lot to do with just regular EMF issues, so for practical advice, hardwire everything that you're going to use in terms of, don't use Wi-Fi. I mean, there's times where you might need to use it, but you just want to be aware that it's the same protocol, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, as a microwave oven, 2.4 gigahertz. So it's literally cooking you and affecting your brainwaves. So it's like, and it's difficult. You have a phone, right? How are we going to get around that? Well, I have it on airplane mode almost all the time. Like I just check in every once in a while, but I try not to always have it on, or at least keep it as far away from myself, especially children, as possible. It's like, think of it as a lit cigarette, like people in social situations and they have their phone next to me, and you might as well have a small cell phone tower next to you, just irradiating you. These things are extremely toxic. So just be careful. And then if you're going to be around them, use flower remedies. Just try to charge your energy field up. You know, I don't mean to let people think we're not extremely resilient, because that's the whole point of my book. But I still want people to be aware of the most obvious harm is this thing that we carry everywhere with us. Never put it in your pocket. You just don't think of it that way. It's very toxic. It's also essential for connecting to the rest of the planet. It's a miracle, but it's got a dark side to it for sure.
Mm-hmm. So many things. Okay, two more things I just want to just touch on, and then we can stop, because we could talk forever.
I know we could.
An apple a day keeps the statins away.
That's good. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good sort of rhyme, because people still think that statin drugs have any benefit for cardiovascular health. And the reality is the trials originally were so manipulated to make relative risk reduction. Let's say instead of 2 people having a heart attack out of 1,000, 1 person did in a highly manipulated trial that's not even true. And they made it seem like it's a 50% reduction.
Ooh.
Semantic sleight of hand. They say that. You see your doctor in the office, they're like, what are you, crazy? You're not going to take this? You'll get a 50% increased risk of heart attack. And that's how they spin the language, so that before you know it, you know, they're pretty much poisoning the entire population under false auspices that it does anything to help you.
So you're saying instead of 2 out of 1,000, 1 out of 1,000, but then using that stat to make it sound like you cut it in half. So
Yes.
You've got a 50-50 chance of dying.
Exactly. So in other words, they poisoned 1,000 people. Instead of 2 people having a quote heart attack, 1 did. And that's a 50% reduction technically in relative risk. By the way, statins are pleiotropic, like chemotherapy or drinking bleach. In some cases, it might have a mild anti-inflammatory effect. The end point could be overall mortality. They're not looking at that. They're looking at, the heart attack went down once, and it could be totally an accident. That's what they spin into this multi-billion-dollar industry. The reality is that the inhibition of low-density lipoprotein production is not a good thing. It's the quality of the LDL that matters, and that's dependent on your diet. It's dependent on whether you're getting good fats and antioxidants. And if you took the LDL in the body, you would die. It's just it's just such a dumbing down. It's like ideological fluoride, most of this medical marketing copy. There's no sanity to it at all. So an apple has so much to offer, but the primary one is it's the polyphenols that help to render the lipids less prone to oxidation, so you don't get the lipid peroxidation, and that means that your blood's flowing smoothly, you're less likely to clot, damage your blood vessels. It's just the way to go.
So essentially, if you have an apple a day, your chances are same or better, I would say better, than taking statins.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that the research is so clear on this topic. I mean, there's even research on statins inhibiting and weakening the heart. We know it depletes coenzyme Q10, the most important, energy cofactor for the heart muscle. The thing is I've studied this in depth by indexing research on it. The statin drug page on Agreement Info has over 300 diseases linked to statin use. The primary modes of toxicity are myotoxicity, damaging of the muscle; neurotoxicity, damaging of the nerves. The heart is the most nerve saturated muscle in the body. So it's like the prescription for cardiovascular disease, like to take a statin. There's no sense to it whatsoever. It really is very sad. But I think most people are starting to become aware of it, because first of all, they feel terrible. Your body just weakens, you feel poisoned, your memory starts leaving you. It's on the black box warning on statins: memory problems, it's diabetogenic.
Yes.
Apples, way better way
apples.
to go.
Okay, yeah. Apples. And then for those of you listening and you're super interested, he also covers the problem with calcium supplements and where you can get natural calcium, like the whole lowdown on painkillers, MSG, wheat, cow's milk, artificial sweeteners, low-fat diets, pesticides, airplanes, and cell phones. Like all of that stuff is in the Regenerate book. just because it's just like clickbait and like everybody wants to know.
Probably.
Sunbathing for belly fat.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I've looked at I think that yes. And you know, the thing about midsection to hip ratio is they did this amazing study in 2007 in Latin America, and they found that active smoking status, blood lipid profiles were less of a factor to cardiac mortality and heart attack rate than hip to like belly fat basically. So the point is that metabolic syndrome is a big deal, you know, where all of us are consuming fructose in excess, often from high fructose corn syrup sources. That stuff is really toxic in terms of what it's doing. And that's the precursor condition to the number one killer, which is heart disease. So it's all connected. It's not to mean like, don't shame yourself. Don't hate yourself for having midsection fat, but acknowledge it's really a form of dietary poisoning as well as toxic and exposure, because a lot of the lipophilic or fat-loving petrochemicals enter into our fat, and it's a way to collagen it off to protect us from the carcinogenic effects they would have otherwise. So when you see hard to lose fat, sometimes it's a matter of, wow, you just need to find a way to naturally detoxify. And that's, again, where certain foods like apples and vegetables and fruits are the key. They nourish and they detoxify. And that's always going to be the way to go.
Yeah. And then if you look back at the Mario Martinez that you mentioned, could you also say that there is a possibility, along with all the other dietary stuff, that you may have patterns in your family or in your DNA around betrayal that would lead to increased adrenaline and cortisol issues, which could lead to belly fat? So you could take flower essences for old betrayal patterns.
Oh my God, you said no. Thank you for pointing this out, because you're right. In fact, I would say they're preemptive. That I'd say that the psycho, spiritual, emotional, and especially intergenerational patterns may be the most, you know, causative in these conditions that we somaticize, you know, in the language of, you know, medical woundology. When yes. So thank you. Exactly.
And why apples? So in your program, you've got this time period where you just only eat organic apples before you sort of reintroduce other things and reset your body and figure out what it actually needs. I love that you include treats like chocolate 72% up and rice as a treat. Those two, I find myself eating those two treats.
I'm half Asian. Oh my God, rice. It's like, it's a joke because, you know, I'm sort of more ancestral diet advocate. So,
but why start with organic apples? I've never heard that before. You
know, it was like a moment I had where I think the apple was literally singing or whispering sweet nothings in my ear. I was just, you know, as I've dabbled with fasting, and when you really are hungry and you eat an apple, there's something about it feeling and being the most perfect food. And you start to kind of recapture the ancestral relationship. It smells good. It's got this delicious taste and texture, and it just cleans the tissues of your mouth. And the seeds themselves have so much value, but they are meant to be passed through us. And there's just sort of something about establishing a relationship with yourself where you kind of figure out what is true hunger and what's morbid. You know, what am I just doing because it's a pattern, a habit, or, you know, am I really hungry? Well, I think if I am, I'd probably eat an apple. And if, you know, so it helps you establish a relationship with yourself where you also are able to tap into the cosmic stream of nutrition, as Rudolf Hashka spoke about. And I'm sure yogis have since the beginning of time, because you don't have to get energy through food. You don't even have to get it through the sun. You can get it, I believe, from the quantum vacuum, which is infinitely abundant, and which, for whatever reason, conventional science and biophysics and cellular bioenergetics wants to pretend like it's all based on ATP, and it's just like a bunch of molecular billiard balls, and, you know, like really grade school economics of inputs and outputs and supply and demand. It's like, really, guys, are we really, you know, hello?
We need to create a lot of demand for GMO corn and wheat.
Exactly.
We need to just eat a lot.
Well, that's what they do. They say, oh my God, we're going to starve to death as a planet if we don't GMO plants that are superior. And they've been lying to us since the beginning. It's absurd. It's the Kissinger model of if you can control the food, you control the population. I mean, come on. It's
And I'm not one of those people who says, oh, we should all just go survive off of sunlight and we don't need to eat, because I love eating so much. But I know that, from my tradition, in terms of the Tibetan lineage, there are practices taught where you're in solitary retreat or you're in a cave and you are directly accessing the juice, so to speak, of the 5 elements, of the water element in your environment, of the earth element, of the air element, and so on. Or you can take substances like chulen, which are like the concentrated packed energy of gemstones, crystals, flowers.
Yes.
So I think there's so much more to the picture, right, than we've been
we
taught.
barely scratched the surface.
And so the apples was just based on your personal experience.
Yeah, because yes, because it's really based on a mono diet approach of not fasting, because I want people to kind of start to move towards having a different relationship with their body, and experience a little bit of the freedom that comes with not having to worry about what your next meal is going to be and preparing and cleaning. And there's something about the simplicity of the apple that frees up so much energy and delight. It's sort of like the original food, from the Garden of Eden, although it's been vilified as some kind of sinful transition. But I would argue that it's the ultimate Aquarian food that we can eat.
So just in sort of wrapping up here, because I could probably talk to you all day. What was the main motivation for your book Regenerate, and what's like sort of the main meaty thing you really want people to get out of it, besides all those like tactical tips and yummy foods they can incorporate into their life? What's the kind of empowerment piece you want people to get?
I'm going to tell you the absolute truth. This is really a Trojan horse for a vision of civilization and what's possible for us individually, that will liberate us to literally, I believe, thousands of years of peace and abundance. Like, I literally think that that's what is in this, because if you look at the physiology I'm describing, there's something called water cavitation I get into briefly in the book. But
I was trying to understand that. Were you talking about when you look at crystals and they have like almost like little trapped pockets of water inside of them?
That's interesting. I didn't think about that before, but there's let's just say that yes, water undergoes an exotic phenomenon known as cavitation, where propellers in nautical situations produce exotic steam bubbles.
No way. Now are you talking about those crazy shrimp with super powers?
That's the Shaolin shrimp. Literally cavitation. And I just found a paper, Katie, the other night that talks about micro cavitation events in the cell membrane. And so in other words, I do believe this is, okay, I know this sounds crazy and it's sort of part of the challenge, but let's just say that there has been a discovery that water is capable of generating through mechanical, acoustical, or laser-induced means temperatures that approximate what you find on the surface of the sun. And so it's actually over unity. It's producing far more energy than whatever the engineering principle was that induced it. And sometimes known as sonoluminescence or star in the jar. Literally, they're able, through certain types of manipulation of atmospheric pressure, as well as inducing these sound waves, to be able to generate a star in water that is not, and when I say star, I mean that there's nucleosynthesis occurring, that the whole periodic chart of elements can be created through some version of this. What that means essentially is you could produce limitless energy, clean and safe, anywhere on the planet, as well as the elements upon which all the geopolitical maneuvering and wars are ultimately based upon, like rare elements and scarcity, through water. And that this is one of those things that the ancients knew. I mean, it's one reason why I have a crystal, because I believe that in the ancient pre-cataclysmic era, they were manipulating these phenomenon, and that's why they could, move a 1,000-ton piece of stone like megaliths. I mean, how else do we explain it? It's because this is endogenous to our native capability. And it's just, so that's actually what's, I think, embedded in this book. But, you know, how are you going to get that out to the public? Thank God for Hay House, because, you know, they got unicorns all over the place. So they let me do what I want.
So to put it in layman's terms, you're saying that there's like an infinitesimal amount of energy that can be accessed through water and its phenomenon.
Yeah, like we're water, and so there's other creatures that have been shown to induce the phenomenon just through striking their.
Can you share that? Because it's just phenomenal, that story.
Yeah, well, there's the thumb splitting, is it called the Mantis Shrimp, where they're able to basically, in some cases, split the thumb of a diver that happens to be unfortunate enough to be struck by one, or break aquarium glass, and they're inducing water cavitation, and they use it to stun and kill their prey. And
break aquarium glass. That is insane.
Right? Oh, pistol shrimp. That's right. The other one's the pistol shrimp, and it creates such a powerful sound that it could. I mean, it's practically lethal. It's like 238 decibels or something, like a gun going off. And it just shows you biological systems can harness 0-point energy. And so there's other examples of the gecko walking on the walls. Humans, I am convinced, are able to induce this, and we can talk about all kinds of other strange.
Oh,
yes. There's
okay. So this would tie into, in the Tibetan lineage,
yes,
masters who have been able to just press their hand or their foot into solid rock and manipulate like it's butter, the material.
Yes.
That would be an example of a human being that's attained a level of awareness so that they can harness 0-point energy.
Yes. Gems being found in the bodies of yogis after, you know, being cremated. Like, I believe we can go, we should do another one when we're ready to talk about this.
Thank you so much for being with us, Sarah.
Oh my God, thank you so much for this opportunity. And yeah, I just so appreciate your work. So thank you.
Likewise.
All right.